I, Lillian Harper, sat in seat 12A on my first ever flight, my fingers gripping the seatbelt so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with the plane's ascent and everything to do with the life I was fleeing. At 28, I was still an innocent, untouched by love, my days consumed by the endless grind at Harper Enterprises, the family business I'd been fighting to save since my father's death 2 years ago. But now, I was running from a marriage I didn't want, a cold arrangement forced upon me by my family to rescue our crumbling empire from bankruptcy. The cabin lights flickered as the plane jolted upward, and I pressed my forehead against the cool window, watching the tarmac disappear beneath a shroud of clouds. My mother, Grace, had begged me to accept this marriage, her frail hands trembling as she clutched mine, her voice barely a whisper. "You're our last hope, Lillian," she'd said, her eyes glistening with tears. Her heart condition had worsened since Dad's passing, and the doctors warned that stress could be fatal. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her too, but the idea of living with a man I didn't love, a stranger chosen for his wealth to save us, was a cage I couldn't endure. So I'd packed a single suitcase, bought a last-minute ticket to a city I'd never seen, and boarded this plane, hoping to find a sliver of freedom. A sudden jolt shook the aircraft, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. My stomach lurched as the plane dipped, the turbulence hitting like a wave. The overhead speaker crackled to life, a calm voice cutting through the murmurs of the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Minor? My nails dug into the armrest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I'd never flown before, and the idea of plummeting through the sky felt all too real. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus on the hum of the engines, but the fear clawed at me, relentless and suffocating. "Are you okay?" a voice asked, deep and steady, pulling me out of my spiral. I opened my eyes to find a man standing beside my seat, his presence commanding despite the chaos around us. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling out the crisp navy uniform of a pilot, golden stripes gleaming on his epaulets. His face was striking, sharp jawline, dark hair swept back, and eyes that held a piercing intensity, like storm clouds on the horizon. Yet there was something in his gaze, a flicker of warmth beneath the steel, that made my breath catch for an entirely different reason. I'm scared," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. I must have looked pathetic, my wide eyes brimming with panic, my hands trembling against the seatbelt. But he didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, he offered a smile. Small, almost imperceptible. But it was the kind of smile that felt like a lifeline in the middle of a storm. It was both gentle and enigmatic, a contradiction that mirrored the man himself. "I'm Ethan Caldwell, the captain of this flight," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to steady the air around us. "I promise you, we'll get through this. I've flown through worse storms than this." He gestured to the empty seat beside me. "May I?" I nodded, too shaken to speak, and he sat down, his presence a strange comfort in the midst of my fear. The plane shuddered again, but Ethan's calm demeanor anchored me. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "You know, the first time I flew through turbulence, I was terrified too. But I learned that the sky always has a way of balancing itself out. You just have to trust it. And trust me." His words were simple, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment, the chaos around me faded. There was something about him, a quiet strength, a hint of mystery, that made me feel like I wasn't alone in my storm. I clutched the small necklace around my neck, a gift from my mother, its heart-shaped pendant warm against my skin. I could still see her face, pale and drawn, her eyes pleading as she'd begged me to stay, to marry the man who could save us. "You're our last hope, Lillian," she'd whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. I'd wanted to scream, to tell her I couldn't do it, but the memory of my father's voice stopped me. "Protect the family, Lillian," he'd said on his deathbed, his hand weak in mine. I'd promised him I would, and that promise had chained me to a life I didn't want until today. The plane leveled out, the turbulence easing, and I let out a shaky breath. Ethan watched me, his gaze steady but not intrusive, as if he understood more than I'd said. "First time flying?" he asked, a faint trace of amusement in his tone. I nodded, managing a small smile. "It's overwhelming," I admitted. He chuckled softly, the sound warm and unexpected. "It gets easier," he said. "The sky has a way of teaching you things, if you let it." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words caught in my throat. There was something about Ethan, Caldwell, something beyond his uniform and title, that drew me in. Maybe it was the way he'd noticed me, a trembling stranger in a sea of passengers, or the way his voice seemed to carry a promise of safety. For the first time since I'd boarded this plane, I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, flickering light in the darkness of my escape. As the flight continued, I glanced out the window, the clouds parting to reveal a glimpse of the endless sky below. I didn't know where this journey would take me, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was flying toward something instead of away. The plane finally steadied, the turbulence fading into a distant memory. But the storm inside me still raged. I, Lillian Harper, sat in seat 12A, my hands still trembling slightly as I loosened my grip on the armrest. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady rhythm that contrasted with the chaos in my heart. I'd just fled everything I knew, my family, my responsibilities, a marriage I didn't want, all to escape a life that felt like a gilded cage. But even thousands of feet in the air, I couldn't outrun the weight of my mother's words. "You're our last hope, Lillian." Her voice echoed in my mind, laced with desperation, her frail hands clutching mine as she begged me to save our family. I glanced at the man beside me, Ethan Caldwell, the captain who'd taken the empty seat next to mine. He shouldn't have been here, not with a plane to fly, but something about his presence felt deliberate, as if he'd sensed my unraveling and decided to intervene. He sat with an effortless confidence, his navy uniform crisp, the golden stripes on his epaulets catching the cabin light. His face was a study in contrasts, sharp features softened by a quiet intensity in his storm-gray eyes. When he'd smiled, earlier, a small, enigmatic curve of his lips, it had felt like a lifeline, pulling me from the edge of panic. "You're not used to this, are you?" Ethan asked, his voice low and steady, cutting through the murmur of the other passengers. His tone wasn't condescending, but there was a trace of curiosity, as if he was trying to piece me together. I shook my head, my fingers instinctively reaching for the heart-shaped pendant around my neck, a gift from my mother, Grace. "It's my first time flying," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect it to be so terrifying." He chuckled softly, the sound warm and unexpected, like a crackling fire on a cold night. "The sky can be intimidating," he said, leaning back in the seat, his gaze drifting to the window where clouds stretched endlessly below. "But it's also beautiful if you give it a chance. I've flown through storms worse than this. Hurricanes, lightning, you name it. You learn to trust the wings, and the man behind the controls." He turned back to me, his eyes meeting mine, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest, a mix of nerves and something I couldn't name. I wanted to ask him how he did it, how he faced danger with such calm, but instead I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't expected. "I'm running away," I blurted out, the words spilling from me before I could stop them. Ethan raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt, his silence an invitation to continue. My family, they arranged a marriage for me, to save our company. It's been struggling since my father died, and my mother, she's sick. She has a heart condition, and she begged me to do this, to marry a man I don't love, to save us. But I couldn't. I couldn't. My voice broke, and I looked down at my hands, ashamed of the tears welling in my eyes. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady, but not judgmental. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost tender. That's a heavy burden to carry, Lillian, he said, and the way he said my name, gentle, deliberate, made my heart skip a beat. I've spent my life in the sky, flying above the world, but I know what it's like to feel grounded by expectations. My family, they had their own plans for me. I chose this instead. He gestured to his uniform, a faint smile tugging at his lips. But there was a shadow in his eyes, a hint of something unspoken, something heavy. I wanted to ask more, to peel back the layers of this man who seemed both untouchable and achingly human, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I listened as he continued, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of my thoughts. He told me about the places he'd flown to, cities I'd only dreamed of seeing, skies he'd navigated through danger and beauty. But beneath his stories, I heard a thread of loneliness, a quiet ache that mirrored my own. Ethan Caldwell was a man who lived above the world, but he seemed as isolated as I felt, a solitary figure in the vast expanse of the sky. When the plane began its descent, the cabin lights dimmed, and Ethan stood to return to the cockpit. Before he left, he handed me a business card, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment, sending a jolt through me. If you need a guide in this city, or just someone to talk to, call me, he said, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Then he was gone, disappearing through the curtain to the front of the plane, leaving me with the weight of his card in my hand. That night, I stood by the window of my hotel room, the city sprawling beneath me like a sea of stars. The lights glittered in the darkness, a stark contrast to the emptiness I felt inside. I slipped out of the stiff dress I'd worn on the flight, replacing it with a soft sweater, the fabric a small comfort against the ache in my chest. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I picked it up, my heart sinking as I saw a message from my mother. Have you landed safely? I'm so worried, Lillian. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over me with a force I couldn't withstand. I'd run away to find freedom, but I'd left my mother behind, her fragile heart breaking with every moment I was gone. I looked down at Ethan's card, my fingers tracing the embossed letters of his name. Captain Ethan Caldwell. I didn't know why I'd opened up to him, why I'd felt safe enough to share my fears with a stranger. But as I stood there, the city lights reflecting in the glass, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was more than just a pilot who'd steadied my fears. He was a mystery, a man who lived above the world, but carried its weight in his eyes. And for the first time since I'd boarded that plane, I wondered if I'd found something worth staying for. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan Caldwell. His voice, a low rumble that had steadied me through the turbulence, echoed in my mind long after the plane had landed. I, Lillian Harper, stood on the balcony of my hotel room, the city sprawling beneath me, its lights a dizzying constellation against the night sky. I'd run away from everything, my family, a marriage I didn't want, the suffocating weight of duty. But Ethan's words had planted a seed of something I couldn't name. Hope, maybe. Or curiosity. Whatever it was, it compelled me to pick up the phone and dial the number on the business card he'd given me. Ethan Caldwell. His voice answered on the second ring, crisp and professional. But there was a warmth, beneath it that made my breath catch. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the phone. "It's Lillian," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. "Lillian Harper, from the flight." There was a pause, and I could almost hear the smile in his response. "I was hoping you'd call," he said, and my heart did a strange little flip. "Are you free tonight? I know a place with a great view of the city." An hour later, I found myself on the rooftop of a quaint cafe, the kind of place that felt like a hidden gem amidst the glitz of the city. The air was cool, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan sat across from me at a small iron table, his pilot's uniform replaced by a tailored black shirt that made his storm gray eyes stand out even more. He looked different out of uniform, less untouchable, more human. But there was still an air of mystery about him, a quiet intensity that drew me in despite myself. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," he said, his gaze steady as he sipped his coffee. The words hit me harder than I expected, and I looked away, focusing on the city skyline to avoid his piercing eyes. "I guess I am," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I told him more than I'd planned, about the arranged marriage I'd fled, about my mother, Grace, and her heart condition, about the guilt that gnawed at me for leaving her behind. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. "I've spent my life in the sky," he said when I finished, his voice low and reflective. "Flying above the world, away from its problems. My family, they're part of this world, the elite, the untouchables. They had expectations for me, a path laid out since I was a boy. Marry well, build the Caldwell legacy, protect the name at all costs." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I chose this instead." He gestured vaguely, as if the sky itself were his rebellion. "But it comes at a price. Always does." There was a hollowness in his words, a regret that lingered beneath the surface, and I felt a pang of recognition. We were both running, in our own ways, me from a life I didn't want, and him from a life he'd rejected. But there was something else, something he wasn't saying, and it stirred a quiet unease in me. I wanted to ask, to press him for more. But before I could, my phone buzzed in my pocket, the sound jarring in the stillness of the moment. I pulled it out, my heart sinking as I saw my mother's name on the screen. "Lillian, sweetheart," she said when I answered, her voice weak and trembling. "I'm in the hospital. The doctors. They say my heart isn't doing well." The world tilted beneath me, the city lights blurring as tears stung my eyes. "I'll be there, Mom," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm coming home." Hung up, my hands shaking as I shoved the phone back into my pocket. Ethan was watching me, his expression a mix of concern and something I couldn't place. "I have to go," I said, standing abruptly. "My mother. She's in the hospital. I need to get back." "I'll take you," he said without hesitation, standing as well. "I can get us on the next flight out." I nodded, too overwhelmed to argue, and we hurried to his car, the city lights streaking past as we drove to the airport. But as we sped through the night, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. "Ask Ethan about Jacob. He's not who you think he is." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I turned to Ethan, my heart pounding for an entirely different reason now. "Who's Jacob?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw clenching, as a shadow crossed his face. For a long moment, he didn't answer, the silence between us heavy with unspoken truths. Finally he spoke, his voice low and strained. Jacob is my son, he said, the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. He's 7 years old. I haven't seen him in years. The confession hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stared at him, my mind reeling. You have a son? I whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than I expected. Why didn't you tell me? Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the road, his expression a mask of pain. Because I'm not the man you think I am, Lillian, he said, his voice raw. I left his mother, Elena, because I couldn't risk my family's name. The Caldwells. We don't make mistakes. And Jacob was a mistake I couldn't afford. I felt the air rush out of me, the weight of his words pressing down on my chest. I'd thought Ethan was different, a man who understood the burden of expectations. But now I saw him for what he was, a man who'd abandoned his own child to protect his legacy. The city lights blurred outside the window, rain beginning to fall in soft, relentless drops, mirroring the tears I fought to hold back. I clutched the heart-shaped pendant around my neck, the one my mother had given me, and thought of her lying in a hospital bed, her fragile heart breaking because of me. I'd run away to find freedom, but now I was caught in a new storm, one of secrets, betrayal, and a man I thought I could trust. As we pulled into the airport, the lights casting long shadows across the tarmac, I realized I didn't know Ethan Caldwell at all, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. The rain battered the windshield as Ethan Caldwell drove us toward the airport, the city lights streaking past in a blur of color and shadow. I, Lillian Harper, sat in the passenger seat, my hands clenched in my lap, the weight of Ethan's confession pressing down on me like a storm cloud. Jacob is my son, he'd said, his voice raw with a pain I hadn't expected. A 7-year-old boy, abandoned by the man sitting beside me, all to protect the pristine reputation of the Caldwell family. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, slicing through the fragile trust I'd begun to build with him on that rooftop cafe. Just hours ago, I turned to him, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Why didn't you tell me? I demanded, my words sharp in the confined space of the car. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel a little too hard. I wanted to, he said finally, his voice low and strained. But I didn't know how. I've spent years burying that part of my life, Lillian. I thought I could keep it separate from this. He glanced at me, his storm gray eyes shadowed with guilt. From you. His words hit me like a punch, and I looked away, my gaze falling to the rain-slicked window. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he had no right to drag me into his mess. But the image of my mother, Grace, lying in a hospital bed, her frail heart struggling to beat, kept me silent. I'd run away to escape a marriage I didn't want, to save myself from a life of duty, but now I was caught in a different kind of storm, one of secrets and lies, with a man I thought I could trust. Why did you leave him? I asked, my voice softer now, but no less accusatory. Ethan's expression darkened, a flicker of shame crossing his face. My family, the Caldwells, we don't make mistakes, he said, echoing the words he'd used earlier. When Elena told me she was pregnant, I was young, just starting my career as a pilot. My father made it clear that a child out of wedlock would ruin everything. The family name, my future, the legacy they'd built. So I walked away. I told myself it was for the best, that Elena and Jacob would be better off without me. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. But I was wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of things. I wanted to hate him for it, for choosing his family's pride over his own son. But there was something in his voice, a raw, aching regret, that made it impossible. I thought of my own choices, of the guilt I carried for leaving my mother behind, and I wondered if we weren't so different after all. We were both running, both hiding from the mistakes we'd made, but the difference was that Ethan had left a child in his wake, a boy who deserved better. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket, the sound jarring in the tense silence of the car. I pulled it out, my heart sinking as I saw another message from an unknown number. Meet me at the ivory room if you want the whole truth. MS. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. MS. Who could that be? And what did they know about Ethan that I didn't? I glanced at him, his profile illuminated by the passing streetlights, and made a decision. I need to make a stop, I said, my voice firm despite the turmoil inside me. Ethan looked at me, his brow furrowing. We're almost at the airport, he said. I need to get you on that flight. This is important, I insisted, holding up my phone. Someone knows about Jacob and they want to meet me. I need to know the truth, Ethan, all of it. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine, but then he nodded, turning the car toward the address I gave him. The Ivory Room was a high-end restaurant in the heart of the city, its sleek glass facade glowing like a beacon in the rain. We stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of expensive wine and hushed conversations, and I spotted her immediately. Woman in a crimson dress, her auburn hair swept into an elegant updo, her smile as sharp as a blade. Margaret Sterling, she introduced herself, extending a manicured hand as I approached her table. I've been expecting you, Lillian. I recognized her name. She was a prominent figure in the business world, a rival of the Caldwells, and, as I now realized, the sender of the mysterious texts. Ethan stiffened beside me, his expression darkening. What do you want, Margaret? He asked, his voice cold. Margaret's smile widened, predatory and unyielding. I want to ruin you, Ethan, she said, her tone dripping with venom. You turned down my partnership proposal years ago, humiliated me in front of the entire industry. Now I'm going to make sure everyone knows your dirty little secret. She turned to me, her eyes glinting with malice. Did he tell you about Jacob? About how he abandoned his own son to protect his precious family name? I'm going public with it tomorrow. Front page news. The great Ethan Caldwell brought to his knees. I felt the blood drain from my face, my stomach twisting with a mix of shock and dread. The thought of Ethan's secret being splashed across headlines, of his life unraveling in the public eye, was overwhelming. But more than that, I thought of Jacob, a boy I'd never met, caught in the crossfire of Margaret's vendetta. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice trembling. What do you gain from hurting a child? Margaret leaned back in her chair, her smile never wavering. Power, darling, she said, and revenge. Leave Ethan now, or you'll be dragged down with him. Consider this your only warning. I glanced at Ethan, his face a mask of fury and fear, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. I was caught between two worlds, my mother's fragile health pulling me back home, and Ethan's unraveling life anchoring me here. I clutched the heart-shaped pendant around my neck, the one my mother had given me, and thought of her lying, in a hospital bed, waiting for me. I'd wanted freedom, but now I was trapped in a storm of secrets, with no clear path forward. As Ethan and I left the restaurant, the rain still falling in relentless sheets, I knew one thing for certain. The truth about Ethan Caldwell was only the beginning. The rain had slowed to a drizzle as I, Lillian Harper, stood outside the Ivory Room, my heart pounding in my chest. Margaret Sterling's words echoed in my mind, her venomous threat hanging over me like a dark cloud. She was going public with Ethan's secret, exposing his abandonment of his son, Jacob, to the world. I glanced at Ethan Caldwell beside me, his face a mask of fury and fear, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement in a kaleidoscope of color. I'd thought he was a man I could trust, a beacon of hope in my storm. But now I saw him for what he was, a man who'd chosen his family's name over his own child. And yet, there was a part of me that couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not until I knew the whole truth. "I need to find Jacob," I said, my voice firm despite the turmoil inside me. Ethan turned to me, his storm-gray eyes wide with surprise. "Lillian, you don't have to do this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is my mess. I'll handle Margaret." But I shook my head, my resolve hardening. "No, Ethan. If Margaret is going to drag Jacob into this, I need to know who he is, what he's been through. I need to see for myself." I didn't say the rest of what I was thinking, that I needed to know if there was anything worth salvaging in the man I'd started to care for. Ethan hesitated, then nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and shame. He gave me the address of Elena, Jacob's mother, a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The drive was silent, the weight of our unspoken thoughts filling the car like a fog. When we arrived, the building loomed before us, its peeling, paint and cracked windows a stark contrast to the glittering world of the Caldwells. I stepped out, the damp air clinging to my skin, and Ethan followed, his presence a quiet shadow at my side. Elena answered the door on the third knock, her face pale and weary, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. She was younger than I'd expected, barely older than me, but her eyes held the exhaustion of someone who'd lived a lifetime of struggle. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice wary as she glanced from me to Ethan. I could see the recognition in her gaze when it landed on him, a flicker of pain that she quickly masked. "I'm Lillian," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "And this is Ethan. We need to talk about Jacob." Elena's expression hardened, but she stepped aside, letting us into the cramped apartment. The space was dimly lit, a single bulb casting shadows across the worn furniture. Toys were scattered on the floor, a small teddy bear with one eye missing, sitting on a threadbare couch. And then I saw him, Jacob, a boy of 7, peeking out from behind a doorway, his dark hair tousled, his eyes so much like Ethan's that it stole my breath. Jacob was small for his age, his clothes slightly too big, but it was his eyes that struck me most. Deep, stormy gray, just like his father's, but filled with a quiet vulnerability that made my heart ache. He looked at Ethan, then at me, his gaze cautious, as if he'd learned too young not to trust easily. Elena knelt beside him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "These people just want to talk," crouched down to his level, offering a small smile. "Hi, Jacob," I said, my voice softer than I'd intended. "I'm Lillian. I heard you like airplanes." His eyes brightened slightly, a shy nod his only response. I pulled a piece of paper from my bag, folding it into a simple paper airplane, something my mother had taught me when I was his age. I handed it to him, and he took it with hesitant fingers, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Want to make it fly?" I asked, and he nodded again, this time with a bit more confidence. We tossed the airplane across the room, watching it glide before it landed near the couch, and for a moment, the weight of the world lifted as Jacob's smile widened, his laughter a soft, precious sound. But the moment was fleeting. Elena stood, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on Ethan. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You've never cared about him before." Ethan flinched, the guilt in his expression almost palpable. "I know I've failed you, Elena," he said, his voice low. "I failed Jacob, but I'm trying to make things right." He glanced at me, as if seeking strength, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Pity, maybe, or the remnants, of the hope I'd felt on that flight. Elena's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "He doesn't even know who you are, Ethan," she said. "I've raised him alone, worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads, while you lived your perfect life in the sky. Do you know what it's like to tell your son his father didn't want him?" Her words cut deep, and I saw the pain in Ethan's face, the way his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her accusation was too much to bear. Before Ethan could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket, the sound jarring in the tense silence. I pulled it out, my stomach dropping as I saw a news alert. Caldwell Ayre's secret son exposed, a scandal in the skies. Margaret had done it. She'd gone public with Ethan's secret, and the story was already spreading like wildfire. I showed the screen to Ethan, his face paling as he read the headline. "She didn't waste any time," he muttered, his voice hollow. I turned back to Jacob, who was still clutching the paper airplane, his innocent smile a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around us. The world was turning against Ethan, the elite society he'd fought to protect now tearing him apart, and I was caught in the middle. My mother was in the hospital, her life hanging in the balance, and I needed to get to her. But looking at Jacob, at the boy who'd been hurt by Ethan's choices, I felt a new resolve stirring inside me. I couldn't let Margaret destroy this child's life, not when I could do something about it. I knelt beside Jacob again, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I'll be back, okay?" I said. And he nodded, his small hand clutching the airplane as if it were a lifeline. As Ethan and I left the apartment, the airport lights glowing in the distance, I knew I was at a crossroads. I could go home to my mother, leave Ethan to face his scandal alone, or I could stay and fight. For Jacob, for the family Ethan had abandoned, and maybe, just maybe, for the man I'd seen a glimpse of on that flight. The hospital's fluorescent. Lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the sterile walls as I, Lillian Harper, rushed through the corridors, my heart pounding with a fear I couldn't shake. My mother, Grace, had called me in the dead of night, her voice so weak it barely carried over the line. "Lillian, I'm in the hospital. The doctors say my heart. It can't take much more." Each word had sliced through me, a sharp reminder of the guilt I'd carried since I'd fled my arranged marriage, leaving her behind to face her illness alone. I'd been running from my responsibilities, chasing a freedom I wasn't sure I deserved, and now I was paying the price. I burst into her room, the beeping of the heart monitor a cruel metronome marking the fragility of her life. She lay in the bed, her frail frame swallowed by the white sheets, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes fluttered open as I approached, and a faint smile curved her lips. "Lillian," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the machines. "You came." I knelt beside her, taking her cold hand in mine, the tears I'd fought so hard to hold back spilling over. "Of course I came, Mom," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I left. I should have been here." She shook her head weakly, her fingers tightening around mine with what little strength she had. "No, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't need to apologize. I've always wanted you to live for yourself, not for me or the family. I pushed you into that marriage because I was scared of losing everything your father built, scared of leaving you with nothing. But I was wrong." Her eyes, filled with a mother's love and a lifetime of regrets, met mine. "Live for you, Lillian. Promise me that." Her words pierced me, a bittersweet ache that mingled with the guilt already tearing me apart. I'd run away to find freedom, but I'd left her to face her fears alone, her heart breaking under the weight of my absence. I pressed her hand to my cheek, the warmth of her skin a fragile comfort against the cold dread in my chest. "I promise, Mom," I whispered, my voice thick with tears. "But you have to fight okay? I need you." The door creaked open behind me, and I turned to see Ethan Caldwell standing in the doorway, his face etched with exhaustion and something else, something raw and unguarded that I hadn't seen before. He'd insisted on driving me to the hospital after we'd left Elena's apartment, after Margaret Sterling had unleashed her scandal on the world, exposing Ethan's secret son, Jacob, to the merciless scrutiny of the elite. The headlines were everywhere now, painting Ethan as a heartless man who'd abandoned his child, and I could see the toll it had taken on him in the lines around his eyes, the slump of his shoulders. "Lillian," he said softly, stepping into the room. "How is she?" I wiped my tears, trying to steady myself as I stood. She's holding on," I said, my voice wavering. "But it's bad." Ethan nodded, his gaze shifting to my mother, a flicker of empathy in his storm-gray eyes. He'd been quiet on the drive over, the weight of his own mistakes hanging heavy between us. But now he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I've made a decision," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm going public. Officially. I'm going to acknowledge Jacob as my son, no matter what it costs me." I stared at him, the words sinking in slowly. The Caldwells had built their empire on perfection, on an untarnished name, and Ethan had spent years hiding Jacob to protect that legacy. Going public now, after Margaret's exposé, would mean facing the full wrath of his family and the world he'd fought to belong to. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw tears glistening there, a vulnerability that stripped away the cold, untouchable facade he'd worn so well. "I'm sure," he said, his voice breaking. "I've spent too long running from the truth, Lillian. I don't care about the Caldwell name anymore. I don't care about the scandal, the money, the reputation. I just want my son. And I want you." His words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing through the walls I'd built around my heart. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for mine, but he stopped short, as if afraid I'd pull away. "I need you, Lillian," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I need you and Jacob. You're the only things that matter to me now." I stood there, frozen, my mother's hand still in mine, Ethan's words echoing in my ears. I'd come to this city to escape, to find a life that was mine. But now I was caught between two worlds, my mother's fragile health pulling me back to the family I'd left behind, and Ethan's broken confession anchoring me here. I thought of Jacob, the boy with Ethan's eyes, his shy smile as we'd folded paper airplanes together, and I felt a fierce protectiveness surge within me. I thought of my mother's words, her plea for me to live for myself, and I realized that living for myself didn't mean running away. It meant choosing the life I wanted, the family I wanted. I looked at my mother, her eyes watching me with a quiet understanding, and then at Ethan, his face a map of regret and hope. "I'll stay," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I'll stay because I've found a family worth fighting for." Ethan's eyes widened, a tear slipping down his cheek, and he reached for me, pulling me into his arms. I let him hold me, the warmth of his embrace a stark contrast to the cold hospital room. And for the first time since I'd boarded that plane, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. I slipped the heart-shaped pendant from around my neck, the one my mother had given me, and placed it in her hand, closing her fingers around it. "I love you, Mom," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek, and I knew she understood. As Ethan and I left the room, the hospital lights flickering above us, I felt a new strength blooming inside. Me, a strength born of love, of family, of the choice I'd made to stand and fight. The hospital corridors felt endless as I, Lillian Harper, walked away from my mother's room, Ethan Caldwell's hand warm in mine. His confession still echoed in my ears. I need you and Jacob. You're the only things that matter to me now. And my decision to stay with him, to fight for the family we could build, filled me with a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. My mother, Grace, had given me her blessing, her frail hand pressing the heart-shaped pendant back into mine as she whispered her pride. But the world outside was far from forgiving. Margaret Sterling had unleashed a storm, exposing Ethan's secret son Jacob to the relentless scrutiny of the elite, and the fallout was only beginning. We drove in silence to Elena's apartment, the city lights a blur outside the rain-streaked windows. I knew what I had to do, what we had to do. Jacob deserved a father who would fight for him, and I couldn't let Margaret's vendetta destroy his life. When we arrived, Elena opened the door, her face a mix of surprise and wariness as she saw us. Jacob peeked out from behind her, his gray eyes, so much like Ethan's, lighting up when he saw me. "Lillian!" he exclaimed, clutching the paper airplane we'd made together. I knelt down, pulling him into a hug, the warmth of his small body a reminder of why I was here. "I want Jacob to come with us," I said to Elena, my voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Ethan is going to acknowledge him publicly, and I want to be there for him, for both of them." Elena's eyes widened, her gaze shifting to Ethan, who stood behind me, his expression a mix of determination and guilt. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, stepping forward. "I've been a coward, Elena," he said, his voice raw. "I let my family's expectations dictate my life, and I hurt you and Jacob because of it. I can't change the past, but I can be the father he deserves now. If you'll let me." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her hand resting on Jacob's shoulder. "He deserves a father," she said softly. "But if you hurt him again, Ethan, I swear I'll make you regret it." Her words were a promise, a mother's fierce love shining through, and I respected her for it. We packed a small bag for Jacob, his teddy bear tucked under his arm, and as we drove away, I felt a shift inside me, a certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Back at Ethan's penthouse, a sleek glass tower overlooking the city, I helped Jacob settle in, tucking him into a guest room with a view of the stars. "Will you make another airplane tomorrow?" he asked, his voice sleepy as he clutched the one we'd made. I smiled, brushing his dark hair from his forehead. "Of course," I said, my heart swelling with a love I hadn't expected. As I closed the door, I turned to find Ethan watching me, his eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, "for giving me a chance to make this right." But the world outside wasn't done with us. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a new alert. Margaret Sterling doubles down, claims Lillian Harper only. Stays with Caldwell for money. The headline was a vicious lie, a final attempt by Margaret to destroy us, and I knew we couldn't let it stand. Ethan had already scheduled a press conference to acknowledge Jacob, but now it was more than that. It was a chance to set the record straight, to show the world who we really were. The press conference was held in a sleek conference room at Caldwell Enterprises, the room packed with reporters, their cameras flashing like a storm of lightning. I stood beside Ethan, Jacob between us, his small hand in mine as we faced the crowd. Ethan stepped to the podium first, his voice steady despite the scrutiny. "I've made mistakes," he began, his gaze unwavering. "I denied my son, Jacob, for years, out of fear of what it would cost me. But I'm done hiding. He's my son, and I'm proud to claim him. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the time I lost," the reporters murmured, their questions sharp and probing. But Ethan didn't falter. When he stepped back, I took his place, my heart pounding as the cameras turned to me. Margaret's lie hung heavy in the air, and I knew I had to address it. "I'm here because of family," I said, my voice clear and firm. "Not for money, not for power, but for the people I love. Margaret Sterling can try to tear us down, but she'll never understand what it means to fight for what truly matters." I looked at Jacob, then at Ethan, and felt a surge of pride. "I'm here because this is where I belong." The room erupted in questions, but I stepped back, my hand finding Ethan's as we faced the storm together. For the first time, he grasped my hand in front of the world, his grip firm and unyielding, a silent promise that we were in this together. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment, but I didn't care about the headlines anymore. I'd found my place, my family, and no one could take that away. Back at the penthouse, I called my mother, who was slowly recovering, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "I'm so proud of you, Lillian," she said, her words a balm to my wounded heart. "You've found your happiness, haven't you?" I smiled, tears in my eyes as I looked at Jacob, playing with his paper airplane in the living room, Ethan watching him with a tenderness I'd never seen before. "Yes, Mom," I said, "I have." That evening, I took Jacob to the balcony, the city lights stretching out below us like a sea of stars. We folded another paper airplane, and I taught him how to throw it, watching as it soared into the night sky, carried by the wind. Ethan joined us, his arm slipping around my shoulders, and I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his presence. I'd come to this city to escape, but I'd found so much more. A family worth fighting for, a love worth sacrificing for. The storm was far from over, but as I stood there, surrounded by the people I loved, I knew we'd weather it together. A year had passed since that fateful press conference, since I, Lillian Harper, stood beside Ethan Caldwell and faced the world, declaring my place in the family we'd built. The storm Margaret Sterling had unleashed had raged for months, headlines, gossip, and the cold disapproval of the elite. But we'd weathered it together, emerging stronger on the other side. Now, as I stood in the garden behind Ethan's penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like a sea of stars, I felt a peace I'd never known before. This place, once a cold monument to the Caldwell legacy, had become a home. A real home, filled with laughter, love, and the kind of warmth I'd always dreamed of. We were gathered to celebrate my mother's birthday, a milestone I'd feared we'd never reach. Grace had fought hard through her heart condition, her recovery a slow but steady miracle, and now she sat in a cushioned chair, a blanket draped over her lap, her smile brighter than I'd seen in years. Ethan stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, his presence a steady anchor in the whirlwind of my life. Jacob, now 8, darted through the garden with a paper airplane in hand, his laughter echoing as he chased the wind, his dark hair catching the glow of the fairy lights we'd strung up for the occasion. "Lillian," Jacob called, running over to me with a grin that melted my heart. "Look, I made it fly really far this time." He held up the paper airplane we'd folded together earlier, its edges crinkled from hours of play. I knelt down, ruffling his hair as I smiled. "You're getting better every day," I said, my voice soft with affection. "Maybe one day you'll be a pilot like your dad." Jacob's eyes lit up, and he glanced at Ethan, who chuckled, a warmth in his gaze that hadn't been there a year ago. "We'll see," Ethan said, his voice tinged with pride. "But you'll be great at whatever you choose, buddy." I stood, watching as Jacob ran back to the garden, his teddy bear tucked under one arm, the paper airplane soaring through the air. I thought of the boy I'd met a year ago, shy and cautious, his eyes shadowed with the pain of abandonment. Now, he was a different child, confident, loved, secure in the knowledge that his father was here to stay. Ethan had kept his promise, spending every moment he could with Jacob, rebuilding the bond he'd broken. The Caldwells had all but disowned him after the scandal, but Ethan didn't care. "They can keep their legacy," he'd told me once, his voice firm. "I've got everything I need right here." I turned to my mother, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders as the evening chill set in. "You look happy, Mom," I said, my voice soft as I sat beside her. She reached for my hand, her fingers still frail but warm, and squeezed gently. "I am, sweetheart," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "You've done so much, Lillian. You've built a family, a real one, and I'm so proud of you." Her words hit me hard, a wave of emotion swelling in my chest. I thought of the girl I'd been a year ago, running from a life I didn't want, boarding a plane to escape a marriage that would have broken me. I'd been so afraid, so lost. But now, as I looked around at the people I loved, I knew I'd found my place. Ethan joined us, his hand finding mine as he stood behind me, his touch a quiet reassurance. I leaned into him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my back, and looked up at him. His storm gray eyes no longer cold, but filled with a love that took my breath away. I remembered the man I'd met on that flight, the pilot, who'd steadied me through the turbulence, his smile a lifeline in the storm. He'd been a mystery then, a man hiding from his past, but now he was my partner, my anchor, the father of the boy I'd come to love as my own. "Thank you, Lillian," Ethan said, his voice low, meant for my ears alone, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself, for giving me a chance to be the man I should have been all along. I turned to face him, my hand resting on his cheek, the stubble rough against my palm. "You're that man now," I said, my voice steady with conviction. "And I wouldn't be here without you." We moved to the center of the garden, where a small table was set with a cake for my mother's birthday. Jacob helped light the candles, his small hands careful as he held the lighter, Ethan guiding him with a gentle touch. We sang "Happy Birthday," our voices mingling in the night air, and as my mother blew out the candles, I saw the joy in her eyes, the kind of happiness that comes from knowing you're surrounded by love. Jacob clapped, his laughter infectious, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude that filled me. Later, as the party wound down, I took Jacob back to the garden, a piece of paper in hand. We sat on the grass, folding another paper airplane, the ritual a quiet bond between us. "Can we write something on it?" Jacob asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. I nodded, handing him a pen, and he scrawled in his childish handwriting, "Fly high like we do." I added my own message beneath his, "Fly high like our love." We stood, and Jacob threw the airplane into the night sky, its white wings catching the glow of the fairy lights as it soared, a symbol of the journey we'd taken together. Ethan joined us, his arm slipping around my waist as we watched the airplane disappear into the darkness. "We made it, didn't we?" he said, his voice soft with wonder. I nodded, leaning my head against his shoulder. "We did," I said, my voice filled with the certainty of a woman who'd found her home. I'd once thought I'd be running forever, but now, surrounded by my family, Ethan, Jacob, my mother, I knew I'd found my happiness, a light that would never fade. If you've enjoyed this journey of love, redemption, and family, don't forget to hit that like button to let me know. And if you want to join me for more heartfelt stories that inspire and uplift, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thank you for being here.